Keanu Reeves walked down the busy streets of Los Angeles with his usual calm face. To the fans, he was a star, a man they had seen on screens in action films, thrillers, and dramas. Strangers waved at him, asked for photographs, and sometimes shouted his name with excitement. On the outside, he looked like someone who had everything: fame, money, and success. But inside, Keanu knew he was walking a very thin line. Hollywood had never fully accepted him the way it had others. There was always a feeling that he was different, not because of his talent, but because he refused to play the game the way the industry wanted. The film studios loved stars who could smile in every photo, say yes to every party, and sell themselves like a brand. But Keanu was not like that. He kept to himself, often choosing to spend evenings alone or with a small circle of friends instead of attending the glamorous events where deals were made and careers were built. When executives looked at him, they didn't always see a man who fit into the shiny image of Hollywood. They whispered in closed meetings that he was too quiet, too reserved, maybe even too strange for the business. Some said he didn't have the charm they wanted in their lead actors. Yet, Keanu never pretended to be something he wasn't. He gave his best to every role. When the cameras rolled, he transformed with a kind of focus that impressed directors and crew members. But once filming ended, he returned to his quiet ways. He wasn't interested in living like a superstar. This honesty made him loved by fans but also created enemies among the powerful people who wanted control. At this time in his career, he had reached a point where the pressure was becoming heavier. He had delivered big hits, but now Hollywood wanted him to follow their plan. Executives began offering him roles that didn't fit his vision. They wanted him to play characters he didn't believe in, scripts that seemed empty but were designed only to make money. Keanu read those scripts late at night in his apartment, and he felt no connection to them. He wanted stories with meaning, something that would move people, not just explosions and loud moments. When he turned down those projects, the whispers grew louder. Producers called him difficult. Agents warned him that saying no to big studios was dangerous. Some reporters began writing small pieces about him, questioning if he was still a bankable star. For a man who had already worked so hard to prove himself, these moments felt like an invisible battle. Keanu carried the struggle quietly. He didn't complain publicly, and he didn't lash out. He continued to show up on time, greet the crews politely, and do his work with respect. But the truth was clear: there were people in Hollywood who wanted him to change, to break, to give up the person he was so they could shape him into someone else. Away from the cameras, Keanu often reflected on his journey. He remembered his early years, the struggles he had faced just to enter the film world. Growing up, life had not been easy. He had moved around often, dealt with challenges in school, and carried the weight of personal losses. Acting had given him a chance to tell stories and escape for a moment, but it was never just about fame. It was about connection. That thought always kept him grounded when the industry tried to pull him in another direction. There were nights when he sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by stacks of scripts and letters. Some were offers filled with conditions: attend these events, pose for these photos, give these interviews. They made success look like a cage, one that was decorated with gold. Keanu would read them carefully and then quietly put them aside. He would rather wait for the right project than lose himself in the wrong one. Still, the pressure was hard to ignore. There were days when even his close friends noticed he was quieter than usual. He didn't share much, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who was fighting battles behind closed doors. The Hollywood system was large, powerful, and unforgiving. Many actors before him had either given in to its demands or disappeared from the spotlight. People wondered if Keanu would become another name on that list. Yet, every time he stepped onto a film set, he reminded everyone of his strength. He didn't need to talk loudly about his talent. It was there in his performance, in the way he treated every role with seriousness, no matter how big or small. Crew members often said he was the kindest star they had ever worked with. He would eat lunch with them, ask about their families, and never act like he was above anyone. These small gestures showed that Hollywood could not take away his humanity, no matter how much it tried. But even as he stayed true to himself, the challenges grew. There were films that slipped away because of politics. There were parties where people whispered behind his back. There were articles that made him sound cold or detached. It was as if an invisible wall was being built around him, trying to limit his chances. He knew it, and he felt it, but he refused to bend. In quiet moments, Keanu thought about what it meant to survive in a world like this. Was success worth it if it meant losing yourself? Was fame valuable if it required you to act like someone else? These questions followed him, but they also gave him strength. He decided that if he had to choose between being famous and being himself, he would always choose himself. The city lights of Los Angeles sparkled outside his window, but Keanu often looked beyond them. He thought of the fans who watched his films not because of his image, but because of the honesty he brought to his characters. That thought became his anchor. He reminded himself that Hollywood might try to shape stories, but the real connection came from people who sat in theaters and felt something real. That was who he worked for, not the boardrooms or the magazines. In this chapter of his life, Hollywood was already trying to push him into a corner, but he stood steady. It was not easy, and the road ahead looked uncertain. But Keanu Reeves had already faced storms in his personal life, and he knew one thing for sure: no matter what the industry tried, he would not let it break him. Keanu Reeves walked onto the studio lot one morning with his usual calm walk. He had just finished a smaller film, one that did not bring a huge box office return but had touched the audience who watched it. For him, that was success. But for the executives in glass offices high above the city, numbers mattered more than emotions. They wanted him to sign on to a bigger project, something they believed would guarantee millions of dollars. When his agent slid the script across the table, Keanu read it slowly. The story felt shallow. It was filled with explosions, loud lines, and characters that were forgettable. He put the script down gently and shook his head. "This isn't for me," he said in his quiet voice. His agent looked worried. "Keanu, this is a major studio project. If you refuse it, they will not forget. They might close doors on you." But Keanu did not flinch. He had lived his whole life making choices that felt right for his heart. Fame was never the goal. The executives, however, saw his refusal as rebellion. Soon, the whispers began again. Behind closed doors, some studio heads called him ungrateful. They said he thought too highly of himself, that he was ignoring the system that had given him success. In truth, Keanu was simply protecting his craft, but Hollywood was not kind to people who said no. Other actors who followed every rule were pushed forward, celebrated at red carpet events. Meanwhile, Keanu's name was quietly pulled from short lists of new projects. It did not take long before the press noticed the change. Small gossip columns began to write stories suggesting that his career was fading. One headline read, "Is Keanu Reeves done in Hollywood?" Another suggested he was becoming irrelevant. These articles were not based on truth, but they were powerful enough to create an image. Fans wondered what was happening. Some believed the rumors, others defended him, but the damage was done. The narrative had been planted. Still, Keanu continued to move forward with calmness. He went to auditions when he had to, even though he was already a star. He read independent scripts, often choosing projects that big studios ignored. While Hollywood tried to box him in, he searched for freedom in unexpected places. Many people in the industry could not understand it. Why would someone who had access to luxury, power, and fame choose the harder path? The answer was simple for Keanu: he valued meaning over money. But the pressure to conform did not stop. There were dinners he was invited to, where producers and directors tested him with questions. They wanted to see if he would bend. They wanted him to laugh at jokes that were not funny, to agree to decisions that went against his values. Keanu sat politely, often quiet, giving short answers. When the evening ended, many left with the impression that he was too serious or difficult. The truth was that he was simply not interested in playing games. Behind the scenes, things became harder. Contracts that once seemed secure slipped away. Directors who admired him hesitated to cast him, worried about angering the studios. He was losing ground in an industry where reputation was currency. Every no he gave cost him something, but every yes he refused to give saved his soul. It was a lonely battle, and at times it looked as if Hollywood would win. At home, Keanu felt the weight of these struggles. He often rode his motorcycle through the streets at night, the city lights blurring past him. On those rides, he found peace. He thought about his choices, the road he had walked since he was a young man trying to act in small plays. He remembered the times when no one believed in him, and he had to prove himself again and again. The doubts from Hollywood were not new, but now they came with sharper edges. The turning point came when a very powerful studio executive called him directly. The man offered him a role that was almost guaranteed to be a hit, but there were conditions. Keanu would have to commit to a long contract, sign away the freedom to choose projects on his own, and agree to appear at every promotional event the studio demanded. It was a golden cage, beautiful from the outside, but a prison inside. Keanu listened silently, then said, "Thank you, but I cannot." The executive was stunned. Few actors would dare to refuse such an offer. The man warned him, "You'll regret this. We can make you, and we can break you." It was not an empty threat. Soon after, Keanu noticed how the roles being offered to him grew fewer. His phone rang less often. Casting directors looked at him differently. It was clear that Hollywood was tightening its grip, testing how much he could endure before he bent. For most people, this would have been the breaking point. To feel the doors closing, to see one's career slipping through fingers after years of work, would have caused panic. But Keanu found strength in silence. He reminded himself of the reason he became an actor, to tell stories that mattered. No one could take that away from him. Even if the roles stopped coming, he would still be himself. The tabloids, however, did not stop. They began writing crueler stories, hinting that Keanu was losing his touch, that audiences no longer cared. Some painted him as strange for his simple lifestyle. They mocked the fact that he rode the subway, that he lived quietly without chasing luxury. But what they saw as weakness, his fans saw as honesty. People began to share small stories of him being kind, giving up his seat, talking gently to strangers, helping crew members carry equipment. Slowly, his humanity became his shield against the false narratives. Still, it was clear, Hollywood wanted to break him. They wanted him to become desperate enough to crawl back, to accept the roles he had once refused. But Keanu did not return to them in weakness. He continued forward with quiet determination. He began preparing himself for smaller projects, independent films, and personal journeys. Each day he reminded himself that storms do not last forever. He believed that truth, even in an industry built on illusions. And though the walls around him seemed to grow higher, he carried in his heart a light that Hollywood could not put out. Keanu Reeves sat quietly in his apartment one evening, the city outside glowing with the noise and light of Hollywood nights. To many, it looked like he was living the dream. He had fame, he had money, and his face was known around the world. But inside, his life carried shadows that most people could not see. He had faced personal losses that were deep and painful, wounds that no camera could capture. These losses stayed with him, and they shaped the way he moved through the world. While Hollywood saw him as an actor, he lived each day as a man who had learned how fragile life truly was. The pressure from the industry was already heavy, but it grew even harder when it collided with his personal pain. There were days when he woke up and felt the weight of loneliness pressing down. Friends told him to keep busy, to go out and distract himself, but Keanu preferred to sit quietly, thinking about what he had lost and what really mattered in life. He understood something many in Hollywood never stopped to consider: fame and fortune could not protect anyone from heartbreak. Instead of letting grief destroy him, he allowed it to become his teacher. Every role he played, every character he brought to life, was touched by the depth of his emotions. Directors noticed how his eyes carried unspoken pain, how his performances seemed layered with something real. What Hollywood tried to twist into weakness became one of his greatest strengths. But outside the film sets, Keanu remained the same quiet man. He refused to let the industry change his way of living. While other stars spent their nights at glamorous parties, Keanu could often be found riding the subway, sitting among ordinary people. Passengers would sometimes look twice, surprised to see him sitting with them, dressed simply, reading a book or staring out the window. He blended in, and that was how he liked it. It gave him a chance to feel human, not just a face on a poster. His kindness also showed in small ways. Crew members on film sets would tell stories about him helping them carry heavy equipment, offering his seat at lunch, or sharing quiet words of encouragement when days were long. He never saw himself as above anyone, and that humility earned him respect from those who worked beside him. In an industry where arrogance was common, his simplicity shone even brighter. Yet, Hollywood insiders could not understand him. They thought his refusal to chase fame made him strange. They whispered that he was not ambitious enough, that he lacked the hunger required to climb higher. But Keanu did not want to climb ladders built on false values. He cared about people, about art, and about living honestly. That choice made his path harder, but it also made it true. During this time, many expected him to break. With fewer offers and constant gossip, they thought he would finally give in to the demands of the system. But instead, Keanu leaned deeper into his private strength. He began spending more time reading, learning, and reflecting. He took long motorcycle rides, using the open roads to clear his mind. The sound of the engine and the rush of the wind gave him freedom no contract could ever provide. At the same time, his fans began to notice the difference between him and other celebrities. Stories of his humility spread quietly across the world. Someone would share how he stopped to talk to them kindly on the street, or how he donated quietly to causes without asking for credit. These stories built a picture of a man who was not like the rest of Hollywood. To his fans, he became a symbol of kindness and strength, someone who proved that it was possible to be famous without losing one's soul. Still, the challenges did not disappear. The studios continued to pressure him. Journalists kept writing about his career fading. Other actors who played along with the system were celebrated, while Keanu stood at the edge, almost forgotten by the spotlight. But he did not measure his worth by magazine covers or award shows. For him, value came from staying true to himself, even when the world pushed him to change. In his quiet moments, he thought about his journey. He remembered being a young boy who had moved from city to city, never fully settled, always carrying a sense of being an outsider. Perhaps that was why Hollywood could never fully control him, because he had lived his whole life on the edge of belonging. That outsider spirit had become his shield, helping him survive in an industry that wanted him to follow rules that did not match his soul. There were times when he felt the loneliness sharply. Fame could be loud, but it could also be isolating. People around him often wanted something from him: an autograph, a favor, a deal. Few wanted to simply sit with him in silence and share genuine company. Yet, Keanu did not let bitterness take root. He reminded himself that life was short and fragile, and kindness was the only answer. Even when Hollywood tried to push him aside, he chose to treat people with respect. This strength did not come from pride but from humility. He accepted that he could not control the way others saw him, but he could control the way he lived. That choice gave him peace. While others rushed to climb ladders, he slowed down and walked his own path. And though it was harder, it was real. The more Hollywood tried to pressure him, the stronger his quiet resistance became. They expected him to break under the weight of rejection and rumors, but each time, he stood back up. He carried his pain like a hidden fire, one that warmed him instead of burning him. It gave his characters depth, his words honesty, and his life purpose. Fans began to notice something special. Keanu was not just an actor, they saw him as a human being who reflected their own struggles. Many people connected with him not because of his action scenes or his fame, but because he lived simply and kindly in a world that demanded show and power. That connection grew stronger with each passing year, slowly turning the Hollywood outsider into a legend admired for his heart as much as his talent. By this point in his journey, Hollywood had not broken him. They had tried with gossip, with rejection, with pressure, but all they had done was reveal his true strength. The losses in his personal life had made him more compassionate. The attacks on his career had made him more determined. And the attempts to control him had only proven that his soul could not be bought. The city of Los Angeles continued to move at its usual fast pace, filled with flashing lights, cameras, and ambition. But Keanu Reeves walked through it with calm steps, carrying with him a spirit that no industry power could touch. He had found his strength not in fame, but in authenticity. And that strength would soon prepare him for the comeback that no one expected. The phone call came on an ordinary afternoon. Keanu Reeves was sitting in his kitchen, quietly making tea, when his agent told him about a project that had been offered. At first, it didn't sound like much. The script was unusual, filled with bold ideas and strange concepts about reality, technology, and human freedom. Many in Hollywood had already laughed at it. Some executives said it was too complicated for audiences, while others believed it was too risky to produce. But something about the story caught Keanu's attention. He read the script late into the night, page after page, until he finished and sat in silence. The world inside the story felt alive, and the character he was being asked to play felt like someone he understood. This was not just another action hero. This was a man searching for truth, for meaning, for answers in a confusing world. Keanu felt a connection, as if the role was waiting for him. When he agreed to take the part, some people shook their heads. They said his career was already struggling and that choosing such a strange project would finish him. But Keanu trusted his instincts. He had spent years turning down films that didn't feel right, and now, for the first time in a while, he had found one that spoke to him deeply. The filming was tough. The directors demanded long hours, intense physical training, and complete dedication. Keanu threw himself into it. He practiced martial arts for months, learned new stunts, and memorized complex lines that blended philosophy with action. On set, he worked harder than anyone, never complaining, always focused. Crew members noticed his discipline, his respect for everyone around him, and his quiet determination. While the industry doubted him, Keanu believed in the story. He didn't care about the gossip or the whispers. He cared about bringing this world to life in the most honest way possible. That was his strength. When he believed in something, he gave it everything. Then came the release. The film opened in theaters, and something remarkable happened. Audiences everywhere were amazed. The story that Hollywood had mocked became a cultural event. People filled theaters again and again, discussing the ideas, copying the action scenes, and quoting the lines. The character Keanu played became unforgettable, and suddenly, he was not just back in the spotlight, he was brighter than ever before. The success was massive, far beyond what anyone expected. The film changed the way action movies were made. It inspired countless other projects, influenced fashion, and became part of popular culture. Keanu Reeves, the man Hollywood had once tried to push aside, was now at the center of something legendary. For the executives who had doubted him, it was a shock. The same people who had whispered that he was finished now rushed to call him. They wanted to offer him new roles, bigger contracts, and more attention than ever before. The narrative had shifted overnight. Where he had once been labeled difficult or unreliable, he was now praised as a visionary and a star who carried one of the most important films of the decade. But Keanu remained unchanged. Success did not make him arrogant. He still rode the subway, still walked the streets quietly, still greeted people with humility. When reporters asked him about the sudden comeback, he simply smiled and said he was grateful. He never bragged, never sought to take full credit. He always mentioned the directors, the crew, the team who worked with him. His humility made the public love him even more. Behind the scenes, though, Keanu knew what this moment meant. Hollywood had tried to break him with pressure, rejection, and rumors. They had wanted him to bend to their rules. But instead of breaking, he had waited, stayed patient, and trusted himself. Now, the very strength that had isolated him, his refusal to compromise, had brought him victory. The studios quickly lined up with offers. He could have signed anything he wanted, filled his schedule with endless projects, and lived in constant luxury. But Keanu was careful. He remembered the days when meaningless scripts were pushed in front of him. He refused to lose himself again. Instead, he chose projects slowly, focusing on stories that spoke to him. As the years went on, the role became iconic, and sequels followed. Each time, fans returned to theaters in huge numbers, excited to see him again. His name was no longer whispered with doubt but spoken with admiration. Young actors looked up to him, not just for his talent but for his strength in staying true to himself. Still, Keanu never forgot the struggles he had faced. He carried them as quiet reminders that success is not permanent and that fame is not everything. This wisdom kept him grounded. While others celebrated wildly, he continued living simply, giving to others, and treating everyone with respect. The more Hollywood tried to pull him into its usual cycle of fame, the more he resisted by choosing authenticity. The comeback was not just professional, it was personal. Keanu proved to himself that patience and integrity were stronger than pressure and control. Every obstacle he had faced, every rumor he had endured, had led to this moment where his choices brought him victory. Hollywood had expected him to fall, but he had risen higher than ever before. Fans across the world noticed his humility even during the peak of his renewed fame. They admired how he carried himself, how he never forgot where he came from, and how he always shared credit with those around him. For them, Keanu Reeves was not just an actor but an example of resilience. The night of one of the film's biggest premieres, Keanu stood on the red carpet, cameras flashing all around him. Reporters shouted his name, asking how it felt to be on top again. He smiled, his expression calm and gentle, and simply said, "I'm grateful to be here." That was all. No long speeches, no proud declarations. Just quiet gratitude. Behind that smile, though, was the story of a man who had endured Hollywood's attempts to control him, who had faced rejection and loss, and who had returned stronger than ever without losing himself. The industry had underestimated him, but he had shown the world that true strength comes from authenticity, patience, and faith in one's own path. The comeback was not just a success in numbers. It was proof that even in an industry as powerful as Hollywood, a person who refuses to break can still find victory. Keanu Reeves had turned doubt into triumph, silence into strength, and struggle into legacy. The years passed, but Keanu Reeves remained the same man who once sat quietly on the subway, blending with strangers. Hollywood had tried to shape him into someone else, but he had resisted. What they had once seen as weakness, his silence, his simplicity, his refusal to play games, had become the very reason people respected him. The story of his struggle and comeback became a lesson not only for actors but for anyone who felt pressured to change in order to fit in. When the cameras turned toward him, people no longer saw only a movie star. They saw a man who had endured pain, rejection, and doubt, yet carried himself with humility. He became a symbol of strength for those who felt like outsiders in their own lives. Fans wrote letters, saying his story gave them courage to keep going when the world tried to push them down. Keanu did not reply with long speeches, he responded through his actions by continuing to live simply, kindly, and true to himself. Even at the height of his renewed success, he refused to take on the image of a glamorous superstar. He still walked into bookstores quietly, rode motorcycles alone through the city streets, and greeted strangers with warmth. Photographs of him sitting on benches, eating a sandwich, or sharing a laugh with fans spread across the internet. People were amazed at how normal he was, how he never allowed fame to build walls between himself and others. In a world where celebrity often created distance, Keanu chose closeness. The legacy he built was not only about the films he made. Of course, audiences loved his characters, the heroes, the fighters, the seekers of truth. His roles had shaped pop culture and inspired generations. But more than that, people admired the man behind the screen. They admired how he carried pain with dignity, how he never spoke harshly about others, and how he gave quietly to those in need. Stories began to spread about his generosity. Crew members shared how he gifted them motorcycles after finishing a film. Fans told of meeting him on the street and being surprised by his gentle kindness. Charities received donations without his name attached. He never announced these things, never used them to gain attention. The truth came out only because others noticed and spoke about it. This made people love him even more. He proved that true kindness does not need an audience. Hollywood itself began to see him differently. At first, they had tried to break him, to push him into the mold they demanded. Now, they realized they could not. Instead, they embraced him as he was. Directors who once doubted him now lined up to work with him. Executives who had whispered against him now praised him openly. The industry that once turned away had to admit that Keanu Reeves had become bigger than the system. But Keanu never allowed these praises to change him. He accepted work with gratitude, chose roles carefully, and gave himself fully to every project. He remembered the darker days when the phone did not ring, when people doubted him, when gossip tried to end his career. Those memories kept him humble. He knew fame was not permanent, but integrity lasted forever. In interviews, he spoke softly, always choosing his words carefully. He never boasted about his success. Instead, he spoke about teamwork, about the importance of storytelling, about respect for everyone on a film set. He often reminded people that movies were not made by stars alone but by hundreds of hard-working individuals behind the camera. These words carried weight because they came from someone who lived them. For fans, he became more than a celebrity, he became a figure of hope. Young actors looked at him and realized they did not have to lose themselves to succeed. Ordinary people saw in him the proof that one could remain humble even while standing under the brightest lights. His story showed that dignity could survive even in the most difficult industries. As years went by, he continued to work, to give, to live with quiet grace. His roles grew into legends, but his legacy grew even larger. People no longer asked only about his films, they asked about his kindness, his resilience, his way of living. He was admired not just as an actor but as an example of humanity. One evening, after another successful premiere, Keanu stood on the balcony of his home, looking out at the city lights. Hollywood stretched before him, loud and restless as always. But he felt calm. He remembered the years when those same lights felt cold, when the industry tried to take away his freedom. He remembered the loneliness, the loss, the rejection. And he remembered how he had chosen not to bend. That choice had brought him here not to fame alone, but to peace. His journey had not been easy. It was marked with pain, doubt, and trials that could have broken him. But each time the world tried to press him down, he rose quietly, without anger, without arrogance. That was his true victory, not the money, not the fame, not the headlines, but the simple fact that he had remained himself. The story of Keanu Reeves became a lesson told again and again. In classrooms, young students spoke about his resilience. In magazines, writers praised his humility. On the internet, fans celebrated his acts of kindness. He became a legend not only because of what he did on screen but because of the way he lived off screen. Hollywood had tried to break him. It had whispered against him, rejected him, pressured him, and painted false pictures. But Keanu Reeves had stood firm. He had chosen integrity over convenience, humanity over image, truth over illusion. And in doing so, he created a legacy far greater than any role he played. In the end, he was remembered not as a star who followed the rules of an industry, but as a man who wrote his own. His life proved that no system, no pressure, and no amount of power could break someone who refused to lose themselves. He had become more than an actor, he had become a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever been doubted, pushed aside, or told they were not enough. The day Hollywood tried to break him, it had failed. And in that failure, the world gained a story of resilience, humility, and courage that would live on long after the lights of the city faded.